Rain hammered the courthouse steps like 1,000 restless hearts, and inside, beneath the echo of judgment and thunder, a boy stood trembling before the judge. Ethan's hands were cuffed, but it wasn't the cold metal that made him shake. It was the sentence he hadn't heard yet, the one hanging like a ghost between breaths. The courtroom smelled of dust, wet coats, and old regret. The judge leaned forward, his face half-shadowed by the flickering light above. "Heal me," he said mockingly, voice sharp with arrogance, "and I'll free your mother." Then he laughed, a sound that cut through the silence like a knife through faith. The room froze. Ethan blinked, uncertain if he'd heard right. His mother. The judge's prisoner? No one moved. The clock ticked loud enough to count heartbeats. Ethan's lawyer shifted uncomfortably, whispering, "He's taunting you, kid." "Don't—" But Ethan wasn't listening. He couldn't. The word mother was enough to burn through every layer of fear he had. He had come here expecting punishment, not a bargain, especially not one drenched in cruelty. The judge smirked. "You look like her," he said almost fondly. The same eyes. The same misplaced faith. His laughter followed, echoing through marble and memory alike, as if the entire courthouse had learned to mock pain, and Ethan, with his bruised knuckles and broken hope, whispered something so soft even the walls leaned closer to hear. "What have you done to her?" "Before we dive deeper, tell me, where in the world are you watching from? It amazes me how far a single story can travel. Drop your city. Let's see how wide kindness still spreads." Ethan had never imagined he'd stand in court. Not at 19, not for a crime that wasn't even his. His mother, Grace, had always told him the world was cruel, but it was supposed to be fair. She'd been a nurse for 20 years, selfless, gentle, the kind of person who held strangers' hands when machines stopped beeping. But that was before the night everything fell apart. It began with a crash, a hit and run on a lonely street, and a patient who didn't make it. The family wanted revenge. The police wanted someone to blame. And somehow, through the cracks of justice, Grace's name slipped in. She was arrested for negligence, fired, shamed. Ethan tried to fight for her, to speak out, but he was silenced by people, by fear, by something darker that lingered behind that judge's smirk. Now, standing before the same man who'd destroyed her, Ethan realized this wasn't about law. It was personal. The judge's health had been failing. Everyone knew, the tremor in his hand, the way he leaned too heavily on the bench. But no one dared talk about it. And now, in this twisted court of power, he wanted something Ethan didn't understand. "Heal me." The boy's voice shook. "You're sick. And you want me to fix it?" The judge leaned closer. "Your mother claims you have her gift, that you touch people and they heal," the room whispered. Even the bailiff looked uncertain. Grace's gift had been a secret, something whispered between hospital beds and prayers. People said her hands could ease pain, slow bleeding, bring comfort where medicine failed. Ethan had seen it. He'd felt it once. But it wasn't a miracle. It was love, pure and exhausting. He swallowed hard. "And if I do?" The judge's eyes gleamed. "She walks free." Ethan stared at the floor, the cracks in the tile like paths that led nowhere. He didn't know what terrified him more, the thought that it might work, or that it wouldn't. Outside, the rain grew heavier, drowning out the noise inside. And in that storm, Ethan made a choice. He stepped forward. "Then tell me," he said quietly. "Where is she?" The judge smiled, and a cruel, satisfied smile, and pressed a button on his desk. A side door opened, and from the shadows, 2 guards led Grace in. She looked fragile, thinner than he remembered, but her eyes, oh, her eyes still carried fire. "Ethan, no," she whispered. "Don't you dare!" He wanted to run to her, but the guards held him back. "Mom, don't!" she pleaded. "He's lying." The judge's laughter filled the room again, low and venomous. "Let's find out, shall we?" The air felt heavier now, like grief had weight. Ethan's heart raced, caught between his mother's warning and the faint, fragile hope that maybe he could save her. He lifted his hands, trembling, unsure whether he was about to perform a miracle or fall into a trap. The judge extended his hand, the one that trembled, and for the first time that night, fear flickered across his face. Ethan took a breath, then another. The world seemed to narrow to that single moment, his palm meeting the skin of the man who held his mother's fate. The courtroom lights flickered. Somewhere, someone gasped, and in that instant, Ethan felt it. A pulse not of power but of pain. The judge's memories flashed behind his eyes. Guilt, violence, something buried deep and wrong. He pulled away, stumbling back. "What? What did you see?" the judge demanded. Ethan stared, tears rising. "You," he began, voice breaking. "You were there that night?" The judge froze. The courtroom fell into silence so deep it felt holy. If you were there in that moment, what would you have done? Be honest, comment your answer below. And if words fail you, just hit, like to prove that compassion still matters. The judge's smirk faltered. For the first time that night, his arrogance cracked. The courtroom, moments ago filled with murmurs, now held only the echo of Ethan's trembling voice. "You were there," he repeated, softer this time, as if the words themselves were afraid to exist. Grace's eyes widened. Her breath caught. "Ethan, what are you saying?" But Ethan couldn't stop. The images that had rushed through him when his hand touched the judge's were still burning behind his eyelids. Headlights, rain, a body on the road, and a man stepping out of a black car, panic on his face. Then the sirens, then the lie. "You hit that man," Ethan whispered, his voice raw. "You killed him, and you blamed Mom." The judge's face turned a pale shade of disbelief, then fury. "Enough!" he barked, pounding the gavel so hard it cracked the wood. "You have no proof. Just childish fantasies." But the room had shifted. People were staring. The reporters in the back, the guards by the door. For a moment, it wasn't a courtroom anymore. It was a confessional. Grace shook her head slowly, tears streaming down her face. "I knew it," she whispered. "I knew someone was covering it up." Ethan felt his chest tighten. His knees almost gave out. "Why?" he asked. "Why her?" "She helped you. She saved your wife once." The judge's jaw trembled. "Because she wouldn't stay silent," he hissed. She was going to tell. She thought justice was bigger than survival. His words cracked with something almost human. Regret twisted into hate. Ethan stepped forward despite the guard's warnings. "Then why now? Why ask me to heal you?" The judge's eyes darted to the trembling hand he'd offered moments ago. "Because," he said bitterly, "when you took my hand, I felt something. I felt her forgiveness. And it terrified me." For a moment, Ethan saw it. Not the cruel man behind the bench, but a broken one, eaten alive by guilt. Grace spoke softly, voice trembling but strong. "You wanted my son to cleanse you, didn't you? Not your sickness. Your soul." The judge slammed the gavel again, though his hand shook too much to hold it steady. "Take them away," he barked. Both of them, but the guards didn't move. One of them looked at Grace, then at Ethan, and something shifted. An understanding, fragile but real. "Sir," the guard said carefully, "maybe we should call for the prosecutor." This isn't right. Do as I say," the judge screamed, veins bulging in his neck. Ethan's heart pounded. He could feel it, the end of control, the unraveling of lies. "You don't want healing," he said quietly. "You want to rewrite your sins?" The judge's eyes blazed. "You think you understand me, boy? You think pain makes you wise? You have no idea what it's like to live every day haunted by one mistake." Ethan didn't look away. "Then stop haunting others." The silence that followed was suffocating. Grace finally stepped forward, her cuffs clinking softly. "You can end this," she said. "Tell them the truth. Let me go, and maybe what's left of you can still find peace." The judge's breathing grew ragged. He looked from her to Ethan, then back again, like a man drowning between guilt and pride. Outside, thunder rolled again, echoing like judgment itself. Suddenly, the judge's hand went to his chest. His breath hitched. "My heart!" he gasped, collapsing forward. Ethan rushed to him instinctively, even as Grace cried, "No, don't!" But he couldn't stop himself. The boy who had every reason to hate still chose to help. He knelt beside the man who'd ruined them, pressing his trembling hands against the judge's chest. "Come on," Ethan whispered. "Stay with me." The judge looked at him, eyes wide, scared, human, and for the first time there was no hatred, no mask. "Just a man begging silently for mercy," Grace sobbed. "Ethan, you don't have to—" "Yes, I do," he said through tears. "Because we're not like him." His palms glowed faintly with warmth. Not magic, not light, but something deeper. Forgiveness. Humanity. The kind that hurts when it heals. The judge's breathing steadied. Slowly, color returned to his face, and in that fragile silence he whispered, "I'm sorry." The words broke something open in the room. A collective breath, a sense of release. Ethan nodded, tears falling freely now. "Then make it right." The judge turned toward Grace, his voice cracking. "You're free," he said. I'll tell them everything." The guards exchanged glances. One stepped forward to unlock her cuffs, his hands trembling. Grace collapsed into Ethan's arms, sobbing quietly. "You shouldn't have done that," she whispered. He held her tighter. "Maybe not, but someone had to." Their embrace was interrupted by the sound of the gavel falling one last time. Not in power, but surrender. The judge bowed his head. "I will face them. I'll face myself." The courtroom was no longer a place of law, but of redemption. Have you ever had someone help you when no one else would? Write yes and tell me their name. Maybe gratitude can travel further than we think. The courthouse emptied slowly, as if time itself needed a moment to breathe. Reporters whispered into phones, guards stood stunned in the corners, and the echo of that last gavel still hung in the air like incense. Ethan and Grace sat together on the cold marble bench, their fingers interlocked, both silent. Not because there was nothing to say, but because words would have broken something sacred that had finally begun to heal. Outside, dawn crept shyly across the gray sky, painting gold over the courthouse pillars. Grace shivered. She hadn't seen the sun from outside those walls in months. Ethan noticed and took off his jacket, wrapping it around her shoulders. "It's over," he whispered, but she didn't smile. "No, it isn't. Truth doesn't undo pain, Ethan. It just sets it free." He wanted to argue, to tell her that freedom was enough, but deep down he knew she was right. The truth may have saved her, but it had also changed them both. A detective approached, his voice steady but kind. "Mrs. Grace Turner, you're officially cleared of all charges. You'll need to give a statement, but you're free to go." Grace nodded, tears glistening in her tired eyes. "Thank you," she said softly. Ethan turned to the detective. "What about him?" "The judge." "He's in custody," the man replied. "And in the hospital. Said he'll confess everything once he's stable." Ethan exhaled deeply, as though he'd been holding that breath since the day she was taken. Good. They walked out together, mother and son, past the cameras that flashed like lightning. People shouted questions, demanded details, but Ethan kept his head down, guiding her through the chaos. When they reached the steps, Grace stopped. She turned to look back at the courthouse, that towering monument of injustice and redemption. "You know," she said quietly, "when they first locked me up, I prayed for justice. Then, when it didn't come, I prayed for strength. But tonight, I think I just prayed for you." Ethan felt something break inside him, the kind of break that lets light in. He hugged her, holding on longer than he should have. Later that night, in their small apartment that smelled of dust and old coffee, Ethan made her tea. The house hadn't changed much. The same photos on the wall, the same blanket folded neatly over the couch. But everything felt different. The air was lighter, though the silence carried the weight of what they'd survived. Grace sat by the window watching raindrops trace lines down the glass. "He said he felt my forgiveness," she murmured. "Do you think people really can be forgiven for something like that?" Ethan thought about the judge's face in that last moment, how fear had melted into sorrow, how hate had finally given way to truth. "Maybe forgiveness doesn't mean it's okay," he said slowly. "Maybe it just means we stop bleeding from the same wound." She turned to him, her eyes soft and sad. "That sounds like something your father would have said." He smiled faintly. "Guess you raised me right." For a while, they sat in silence, the city murmuring outside. Then Grace's hand trembled. She pressed it to her chest, her face paling. "Mom?" Ethan rushed to her side. "Hey, breathe, okay? What's wrong?" She shook her head, forcing a smile. "It's nothing, sweetheart, just too much emotion tonight." But Ethan wasn't convinced. He remembered the years of stress, the long hours in hospitals, the sleepless nights. He remembered how she'd given all her strength to others, and now had none left for herself. He stayed beside her until she fell asleep. Then he sat at the window, watching the streetlights blur into rain. In the distance, an ambulance wailed, hauntingly familiar. He wondered if the judge heard it too, lying somewhere between guilt and redemption. The next morning, Grace woke before sunrise. She moved slowly, her steps soft, as if afraid to wake the world. Ethan was already up, sitting with a notepad in front of him. "What's that?" she asked gently. He hesitated, then smiled. "A letter to the families of the victims. I thought, maybe I should tell them the truth. Not from the courts, but from us." Grace's eyes filled. "That's brave," she whispered. He shrugged. "It's the least I can do." As he wrote, his words felt like stitches, mending something he hadn't realized was still torn. For every apology he couldn't say aloud, ink carried it instead. Grace reached over and touched his shoulder. "You've done more healing than I ever did," she said softly. He looked at her, the woman who'd spent her whole life healing others and still managed to forgive the world that broke her. "No, Mom," he said. "You just taught me how. Now it's your turn. Share one small good thing you did recently. Write it below so others remember that humanity still lives. Your story might light someone's path tonight." Days turned into weeks, but peace didn't arrive the way they thought it would. Justice had been served on paper, yet both Ethan and Grace carried ghosts that didn't fit neatly into any verdict. The city moved on. Newspapers found new scandals. The courthouse returned to routine. But inside their little apartment, time seemed slower, heavier. Grace spent most mornings by the window, her teacup untouched, staring at the horizon as though she could still hear echoes of the gavel. Ethan watched her quietly from the kitchen table, pretending to focus on job applications that never seemed to go anywhere. He wanted to believe she was okay, that the release had healed her. But her silences were longer now, her smiles thinner. Sometimes in the quiet, he'd hear her whisper a name, not his, not the judge's, but Michael, his father, a man who'd died years ago in an accident that had left their hearts fractured. That morning, when sunlight slipped through the curtains, Grace turned to him suddenly. "Ethan," she said, her voice fragile but steady, "there's something you need to know." "About your father," he froze. "What about him?" She hesitated, then stood, her hands trembling slightly. "The night he died, he was on his way to meet the same man, the judge." Ethan frowned, confused. "Why?" "Because Michael knew," she said. "He knew about the hit and run. He found evidence that would have cleared me. He was going to confront him, but he never made it." The room went still. Ethan's chest tightened. "You're saying the judge—" She nodded slowly, her eyes glistening. "It wasn't an accident, Ethan." The words crashed through him like glass. The world blurred at the edges. "He killed Dad?" Grace lowered her gaze. "I think so. But we can't prove it. The case was buried years ago." Ethan stood up so fast his chair fell backward. "No, he confessed to one crime. He can confess to all of it. I'll make him." "Ethan, no. But he was already at the door. He ran through the streets." Through rain that felt too familiar, until the hospital came into view. The same hospital where Grace had worked for decades. Now sheltering the man who had destroyed everything she loved. Inside, the corridors smelled like antiseptic and regret. He found the room easily. A guard stood outside, bored but alert. "I just want to talk," Ethan said, breathless. The guard sighed, but recognition flickered in his eyes. 5 minutes. Inside, the judge lay pale against the sheets, oxygen tubes running beneath his nose. His eyes opened slowly when he heard the door. "You came," he rasped. Ethan didn't sit. "You killed my father." The judge's eyes twitched, but he didn't deny it. "He wouldn't let it go," he whispered. "He said he'd expose me." I panicked. It wasn't supposed to happen like that. Ethan felt the air leave his lungs. For a moment, all he could hear was the monitor's steady beep, a cruel rhythm of life that the man before him didn't deserve. "Do you know what you did to us?" he asked, voice shaking. "You didn't just take him. You took her. You turned her into someone she's not." The judge looked away. "I've lived with it every day," he murmured. "That's why I asked for healing. Not for my body, but for my soul." Ethan's hands clenched. "You think forgiveness is something you can buy? That my mother's grace is a medicine you can steal?" The old man's eyes filled with tears. "No," he said. "But maybe it's something I can finally earn." Ethan stared at him for a long moment. He wanted to hate him. He wanted to scream. But instead he whispered, "Then confess. Publicly. Don't let her carry your sins anymore." The judge nodded weakly. "I will," he said, "but not for redemption. For her." Ethan turned to leave, but the judge called after him. "Ethan." He stopped. "Your father was brave," the man said softly. "He didn't die in vain. His truth found its way to you." Ethan closed his eyes. "I'll make sure the world hears it." Outside the hospital room, he stood still for a long time. The hallway lights flickered faintly, and for a moment, he thought he saw his father's reflection in the glass, just standing there, smiling proud. That night, Ethan returned home and told Grace everything. She cried, not the kind of tears that begged for revenge, but the kind that finally allowed grief to breathe. They sat together in silence, holding hands, knowing that their story wasn't about justice anymore. It was about surviving what justice couldn't fix. "If you ever lose someone," Grace whispered, "and you're left holding only their memory, promise me you won't let the pain turn you into something you're not." Ethan nodded, his voice soft. "I promise. If that moment hit you hard, leave a... Sometimes one little symbol says what our hearts can't." The next morning, sunlight spilled across the apartment floor, soft and golden, but it couldn't warm the ache that lingered in their hearts. Grace moved slowly, her hands tracing the mug Ethan had left by the sink, her reflection faint in the kitchen window. She looked tired but peaceful, like someone who had finally stopped running. Ethan came out of his room holding his phone. "They're reopening Dad's case," he said quietly. "The confession is on record. The detectives found old files the judge buried." Grace looked at him, startled. "So, it's really happening?" He nodded. "It's justice, Mom. Real this time." She smiled faintly, but her eyes shimmered with tears. "Justice feels different when it finally arrives," she said softly. "It's not victory. It's just silence after a long storm." Ethan understood. The world might celebrate the story, but for them it was never about headlines. It was about peace, and peace, he was learning, came quietly. That evening they visited his father's grave for the first time since the truth had come out. The air was cool, and the cemetery smelled of wet grass and memory. Grace knelt beside the headstone, her hand brushing away the leaves. "Michael Turner," she whispered. "You were right." "You always were." Ethan stood behind her, his throat tight. "I wish I could have known him more," he said. "Not through stories, but through moments." Grace turned, smiling gently. "You do know him. Every time you choose kindness over anger, that's him. Every time you stand up for someone, that's him." Ethan swallowed hard. Then I guess he never really left. They stayed until the sun began to sink, the sky bruised with pink and gold. When they finally walked back to the car, Grace paused, glancing toward the horizon. "You know," she said softly, "he used to believe we all carry a piece of heaven inside us. That's why he forgave so easily. He said forgiveness keeps the light alive." Ethan smiled faintly. "Guess I didn't get that part of him." She chuckled softly. "Oh, you did. You just hide it better." Back home, Ethan found himself unable to sleep. The apartment felt too quiet, too still. He wandered to the living room where Grace's old journal lay half open on the couch. The handwriting was delicate, curved like her smile. He hesitated, then picked it up. Most of it was filled with patient names, people she'd cared for over the years, each entry ending with a prayer, a line of hope. But one page caught his eye. It was dated just a week before her arrest. If I could trade my freedom for Ethan's peace, I would do it without question. But maybe one day he'll learn that even pain can teach love. Ethan's throat tightened. He closed the journal gently, pressing his forehead against it. "I did, Mom," he whispered. "I learned." A few days later, they were invited to the courthouse again, not as prisoners, but as witnesses. The judge, frail and remorseful, was led in on a wheelchair. The room that once held fear now held something heavier. Truth. When it was Grace's turn to speak, she stood tall, her hands clasped in front of her. "I forgive you," she said simply. "Not because you deserve it, but because I need to breathe again." A hush fell over the courtroom. The judge looked up, tears running freely down his face. "You saved me twice," he said hoarsely. "Once in the hospital, and now," Grace nodded. "Then don't waste the second chance." Ethan watched her, awe mixing with heartbreak. He realized she wasn't forgiving just him. She was forgiving the years stolen, the whispers, the shame, the sleepless nights. She was forgiving the world. After the hearing, as they walked down the steps together, reporters shouted questions again, cameras flashing like restless stars. But Grace just smiled and kept walking, her hand in Ethan's. He leaned close. "You meant it, didn't you?" "Every word." "I did," she said. "Forgiveness doesn't erase pain. It just stops pain from owning you." The words stayed with him, echoing long after the cameras faded. That night, Ethan posted online, not for attention, but to tell others what his mother had taught him. Sometimes justice looks like forgiveness wearing scars. The post went viral. Thousands of strangers wrote back, stories of grief, love, redemption. And for the first time, Ethan realized how far one act of kindness could travel. Be honest. Could you forgive after what they did? Type forgive if you could, or never if it would break you too deeply. Weeks slipped quietly into months. The trial was over, the headlines faded, and the world moved on. But Ethan and Grace were still learning what it meant to live without fear. Healing, they discovered, wasn't a moment. It was a process, slow, uneven, like rain trying to wash away years of drought. Grace began volunteering at a free clinic again. The patients were different now, mothers clutching children, old men with stories in their eyes. But her hands remembered what compassion felt like. Sometimes she'd pause mid-shift thinking about the judge, about how pain had turned her gift into a curse for so long. Now, each life she touched became a quiet act of defiance, proof that she still believed in good. Ethan found work at a community center, teaching art to kids who had too much anger in their hearts for their age. He'd bring paints and brushes and tell them, "Color is what words can't say." The kids didn't always listen, but when they did, when they created something bright out of darkness, he saw himself in them. One evening, as the sun dipped low behind the city skyline, he found Grace sitting on the porch, sketching in a notebook. "You never told me you could draw," he said, smiling. She chuckled softly. "I can't," she admitted. "But it helps me remember. Your father used to say art is how we talk to the people we've lost." He sat beside her, looking at the unfinished sketch. A figure of a man standing under rain, half shadow, half light. "That's him, isn't it?" She nodded, tears glistening in the fading light. "Every time I draw him, he seems less like a memory and more like forgiveness." They sat quietly, the air thick with unspoken love. Later that night, a letter arrived in the mail. No return address, just a courthouse seal. Ethan opened it carefully. Inside was a short note written in trembling handwriting. "To Grace and Ethan, I've made my confession public. The families know the truth. I will serve my sentence with what years I have left. Thank you for showing me that mercy can exist where it shouldn't. Harold Crane." Ethan read it twice before handing it to his mother. Grace's expression didn't harden. It softened. "He did it," she whispered. "He really did." Ethan leaned against the wall, arms crossed. "Do you think he'll ever forgive himself?" She looked up at him, her eyes calm and steady. "Forgiveness isn't for him anymore, Ethan. It's for us, so we can stop carrying what isn't ours." Her words stayed with him long after she went to bed. That night, Ethan walked through the city alone. Streetlights hummed softly above him, casting halos on the wet pavement. He passed the old courthouse, now just another building, stripped of its ghosts. He stopped there for a long moment, staring up at the dark windows. "You don't own me anymore," he whispered. The wind carried his words away like ashes. He walked on, past the park, past the closed diner where he used to wait for his mom after her shifts, until he reached the bridge overlooking the river. The water shimmered with city lights. He took a deep breath. "Dad," he murmured, "I hope you're proud of us." A quiet peace settled over him. Not happiness, not closure, but something simpler. Acceptance. When he returned home, he found Grace asleep on the couch, the TV still on. A painting sat on the table beside her, the sketch now colored in. The man in the rain was smiling. He sat down beside her, smiling through tears. "You finished it," he whispered. In the faint glow of the screen, he noticed one last line written under the painting, his mother's handwriting. "Love is what remains when justice is done." He turned off the light, letting her sleep beneath that truth. If you believe love still wins, comment Amen. Let's fill this section with hope. Maybe someone scrolling right now needs to see it. Autumn came early that year. The leaves turned amber before anyone was ready, and the air carried that sweet ache of endings, quiet streets, fading warmth, and the sound of rain tapping on rooftops like gentle reminders of time passing. Ethan had learned to love the quiet. He painted in the mornings now, often beside his mother, both lost in their own worlds of color and memory. Sometimes they spoke, sometimes they didn't. Silence between them was never empty. It was full of everything they no longer needed to explain. One evening, while Grace was making soup, the phone rang. Ethan answered, half expecting another reporter trying to resurrect the story. But the voice on the other end wasn't a stranger. "Ethan Turner?" "Yes, who's this?" "This is Nurse Adeline from St. Matthew's Hospital. I'm calling about Harold Crane." Ethan froze. "The judge?" "Yes," she said softly. "He requested to see you and your mother." "He's in hospice care now. He doesn't have much time left." Ethan didn't answer right away. He stared at the floor, the past rising around him like fog. "I'll ask my mother," he said finally, his voice low. When he told Grace, she didn't speak for a long time. The soup on the stove began to simmer too long before she quietly turned it off. "He wants to see us?" "Yeah," Ethan said. "You don't have to, Mom. You owe him nothing." She looked up, her eyes calm, not forgiving, not angry, just tired. "Maybe I don't owe him. But maybe I owe myself the peace of goodbye." The next day, they went together. The hospice smelled of lavender and medicine, that strange mix of comfort and farewell. They found the judge lying by the window, sunlight pooling across his face. He looked small, almost childlike, stripped of everything that once made him powerful. He turned his head slowly as they entered. "You came," he whispered. Grace nodded, standing by the door. "You asked for us." "I did," he said weakly. "Not to ask forgiveness, but to give it to myself." For the first time, Ethan stepped closer, cautious. "You think that's how it works?" The old man smiled faintly. "I don't know. I just wanted to say, you were right. Forgiveness isn't about worth. It's about release." Grace approached his bedside, her movements soft, measured. She took his hand, the same hand that once held her fate. "Harold," she said quietly, "you've carried your sins long enough. Let them rest." He nodded, tears slipping down his cheeks. "And you've carried pain that wasn't yours. Let that rest too." For a long moment, The room was silent except for the faint hum of the heart monitor. Outside, wind rustled through trees, scattering the last leaves of summer. Ethan felt something shift in that silence. Not forgiveness, not closure, but understanding. The kind that only comes when all anger has burned itself out. The judge's breathing grew slower. He looked at Ethan one last time. "You're stronger than I ever was," he whispered. "Take care of her," Ethan nodded. "I always do." Moments later, Harold Crane exhaled, a long, fragile sigh, and was still. Grace closed her eyes, whispering a quiet prayer. She didn't cry. She just stood there, holding his lifeless hand, and when she finally let go, it felt like laying down a burden she'd carried too long. Outside, the sky opened, not with thunder this time, but with gentle rain, soft and cleansing. Grace stepped out into it, lifting her face to the gray heavens. Ethan followed, watching as droplets ran down her cheeks, blending with tears she didn't need to hide anymore. "He's gone," he said softly. "I know," she whispered, "and so is the anger." They stood in the rain until it soaked through their clothes, until the chill turned into warmth, the strange warmth of release. When they returned home, the world felt lighter somehow. Grace went to bed early, and Ethan sat alone by the window, looking at the city lights reflecting on wet streets. He thought about everything: his father's courage, his mother's strength, the judge's broken redemption, and realized that every story, even the painful ones, carried a piece of healing inside it. He opened his notebook and began to write again. But this time it wasn't a letter or a confession. It was a story, theirs, one that began in pain and ended in grace. His final line read, "Sometimes we don't heal by forgetting. We heal by remembering and still choosing love anyway. If you believe love still wins, comment Amen." Let's fill this section with hope. Maybe someone scrolling right now needs to see it. Winter crept in quietly, the kind of winter that doesn't roar but whispers. Soft snow falling on rooftops, the hum of distant traffic, the hush of streets wrapped in gray stillness. Ethan stood by the window one morning, coffee in hand, watching his breath fog the glass. It had been 3 months since the judge's passing. 3 months of peace he didn't quite know what to do with. Grace had grown stronger. Her laughter came easier now, her steps lighter. She'd started teaching first aid at the local school, showing children how to save lives, how to touch pain and turn it into care. Sometimes Ethan would walk past the classroom and hear her laugh echo through the hallways. It reminded him of sunlight after rain. He was painting again, too, not for money or praise, but because it helped him make sense of everything. His latest canvas stood in the middle of the room, a simple scene, a courtroom with no judge, no jury, just light spilling through broken windows. Grace walked in, drying her hands on a towel. "That one's different," she said, tilting her head. Ethan smiled. "It's supposed to be. It's not about judgment anymore. It's about freedom." She stepped closer, studying the brush strokes. "You've changed," she said softly. He chuckled. "You sound surprised." "I'm proud," she corrected. "You took all that pain and built something gentle from it. Your father would have loved this." He turned, meeting her gaze. "I think he already does." They shared a quiet moment, the kind that didn't need words. Then Grace glanced toward the window. Snow was beginning to fall heavier now, each flake catching the faint morning light. "It's beautiful," she whispered. Ethan nodded. "Yeah, it is." That night, the world outside was blanketed in white. Grace made hot chocolate, humming softly as she stirred. Ethan watched her, realizing how much lighter her face looked when peace finally replaced pain. "You ever think," he asked quietly, "that maybe all this had to happen for us to find who we really are?" Grace paused, then smiled faintly. "Maybe. Or maybe life just keeps breaking us until we remember how to heal." He leaned back, letting her words sink in. "You sound like a poet now," she laughed. "No, just a woman who's tired of carrying yesterday." He smiled, sipping his drink. Then let's not carry it anymore. The next morning, Ethan stood outside their apartment holding a small envelope. Inside was a painting, the one of the courtroom filled with light. He wrote a note and slid it inside. For the families we hurt, for the ones who forgave, and for the ones still learning to. May this light find you. 2. He sent it anonymously to the courthouse. A week later, they received a reply, unsigned, written in uneven handwriting. We saw your painting. It hangs in the main hall now. People stop and stare. It feels like peace. Ethan read it aloud, his voice soft. Grace smiled, tears brimming. Then maybe, she whispered, we finally healed more than ourselves. They stood together side by side. As morning sunlight spilled across the room, the same golden hue that had once filled that courtroom months ago. But this time it wasn't judgment. It was grace, pure and unburdened. Grace placed her hand on his arm. Whatever happens next, she said, promise me one thing. Don't let bitterness make you forget how to love. He nodded. I won't. I learned from the best. She chuckled softly, brushing his cheek. Then that's all I ever needed to hear. Outside, the world was silent, snow still falling, soft and endless. Ethan picked up his brush again and began painting something new, a mother and son walking into light. As he worked, he whispered to himself, we're free now, Mom, and for the first time in years, his heart believed it. If this story moved you, don't scroll past quietly. Tap like. Not for me, but for the soul who carried this pain and still stayed kind. One click can be your way of saying, I felt you.